The First Buddhist Council, how the teachings were preserved. Night falls softly in the forest. Not suddenly, not with drama, but like a breath released after a long holding. The world quiets. Leaves stop trembling. Even the insects seem to listen. There is something ancient in this silence, something older than words, older than memory. It is the same silence that follows loss, the stillness that comes when a guiding presence is gone. The Buddha had passed away, not into nothingness but beyond what language could hold. Yet for those who remained, monks, wanderers, seekers, the air felt heavier, not with despair, but with responsibility. When a great tree falls, the forest does not cry out, but the wind changes, the shadows shift, and those who lived in its shade must now learn how to stand. This is where our story began, not with enlightenment beneath a Bodhi tree, not with miracles or sermons to kings, but with human beings, sincere, imperfect, devoted, sitting together in uncertainty. They carried no scriptures, no books, no recording. They carried memory, breath, practice, and a deep, quiet fear. What if the teachings fade? What if they fracture? What if the path is lost to time? In a world like ours, where information multiplies endlessly, yet wisdom feels scarce, this question still trembles in the heart. How does truth survive after the voice that spoke it is gone? How does clarity endure when the world pulls toward confusion? How does a path remain visible when generations pass and minds change? The First Buddhist Council was not an event of power. It was an act of care, a circle of listeners, gathering not to create something new, but to remember, faithfully, humbly, what had already been lived. This is not only their story, it is ours, because every time we sit quietly and try to remember what truly matters, we become part of that same ancient circle. After the Buddha's passing, the world did not stop turning. The sun still rose over dusty roads. Monks still walked barefoot for alms. Rivers still flowed without concern for doctrine or grief. Yet something subtle had changed. For decades, the Buddha had been a living compass, not a ruler, not a god, but a presence. When questions arose, one could walk toward him. When doubts stirred, one could listen to his voice, calm, precise, rooted in direct seeing. Now that voice was silent, and silence can be fertile or dangerous. In the months that followed, whispers began to move through the Sangha. Some were gentle, sincere reflections. Others were small distortions, not born of malice, but of misunderstanding. The teaching remembered slightly differently. An emphasis shifted, a phrase softened or sharpened. This is how all traditions begin to change, not through betrayal, but through forgetting the weight of a single word. Among the elders, one monk felt this danger more clearly than most. Mahākassapa. He was not the most eloquent, not the most beloved, but he carried an unyielding devotion to simplicity and discipline, a mountain-like steadiness that does not bend easily to opinion. As the Buddha's funeral pyre cooled, Mahākassapa listened, and what he heard troubled him. Some monks spoke freely. Now that the teacher has gone, we are no longer bound by every rule. Others suggested adjusting practices to suit comfort, climate, convenience. Nothing outrageous, nothing obviously wrong, and yet something essential was slipping. Mahākassapa understood a truth that history often forgets. The Dharma does not disappear all at once. It erodes quietly, grain by grain, when vigilance softens into assumption. So he called for a gathering, not a council of rulers, not a debate for clever minds, but a meeting of those who had lived closest to the Buddha's presence. 500 arahants, it is said, those whose minds were settled, whose seeing was clear. They gathered at Rajagaha in the Satapani cave, a cave, not a palace. Stone walls, cool air, echoes shaped by nature, not architecture. This choice alone speaks volumes. Truth, when preserved, does not need grandeur. It needs sincerity. No banners announced the event. No proclamations were sent to distant lands. The world barely noticed. But what happened there would ripple across centuries. They sat together not as authors, but as witnesses. The purpose was simple, yet profound: to recite the teachings exactly as they had been heard, to hold them steady like a flame shielded from wind. Ānanda was invited to speak. Ānanda, the Buddha's attendant, his constant companion, the one who had walked beside him day after day, year after year, the one whose memory was said to be vast and precise. Yet even Ānanda hesitated, not because he doubted the teachings, but because he doubted himself. This detail matters. The preservation of the Dharma did not begin with confidence, but with humility. Ānanda had heard thousands of discourses. He had been present for moments of deep compassion and moments of sharp clarity. But memory is a living thing. It breathes. It shifts. So before the council began, Ānanda spent the night in meditation, not cramming information, not rehearsing speeches. He settled the mind, and in that stillness, insight ripened. Only then did he take his seat among the elders. When he began to recite, he did not say, "This is the truth." He said, in essence, "This is what I heard. This is how it was spoken. This is how it was remembered." There is something profoundly human here. The teachings were not carved into stone tablets by divine hands. They were spoken, heard, remembered, and offered again, filtered through breath, body, and mind. Each discourse was recited aloud. Others listened, not passively, but attentively. If something felt off, they questioned it. If something resonated deeply, they confirmed it. This was not consensus by authority. It was resonance through shared realization. The Vinaya, the monastic discipline, was recited first. Not the lofty philosophy, not the poetic metaphor, but the rules of conduct. Why? Because a teaching survives not through ideas alone, but through how people live. Without ethical grounding, wisdom becomes decoration. Insight becomes performance. Only after the foundation of conduct was firmly recalled did they turn to the discourses, the teachings on suffering, impermanence. Nothing new was added, nothing old was embellished. Their task was not to improve the Dharma, but to get out of its way. And here lies a quiet lesson for our time. We live in an age obsessed with innovation. We refine, remix, optimize everything, including wisdom. We assume that newer is better, louder is clearer, faster is true. But the First Buddhist Council moved in the opposite direction. They slowed down. They listened deeply. They trusted silence as much as speech. They understood that truth does not need reinvention, only careful remembering. Imagine the atmosphere in that cave. Breath moving softly in the dark. Voices reciting teachings shaped by compassion. Listeners holding each word not as information, but as lived experience. This was not preservation through fear. It was preservation through love. Love for the path. Love for future generations they would never meet. Love for beings yet unborn who would suffer, question, and seek release. None of them could know that these recitations would travel across continents, that they would be carried by traders, monks, refugees, and pilgrims. That centuries later people would still sit quietly, listening to echoes born in that cave. They did not preserve the Dharma for fame. They preserved it because forgetting would cause harm. And perhaps this is the most important truth the First Council offers us today. The teachings survived not because they were written early, but because they were lived deeply. Memory alone is fragile. Practice gives memory bones. When conduct aligns with understanding, when mindfulness steadies speech, when compassion tempers interpretation, then a teaching becomes self-sustaining. As the council concluded, there was no declaration of success, no sense of finality, only continuation. The Dharma had been entrusted, not sealed, and so it passed from breath to breath, from mind to mind, from silence into sound, and back again. In the next part, we will look more closely at what it truly means to preserve a teaching, not just across centuries, but within a restless human heart. For now, let us pause here, like those elders in the cave, listening carefully so nothing essential is lost. Preservation is often imagined as an act of holding tightly, as if truth were something fragile that must be locked away, protected from touch, sealed against change. But the elders of the First Council understood something subtler. A teaching that is clutched too tightly suffocates. A flame shielded completely from air will die. So the Dharma was preserved not by freezing it in time, but by allowing it to breathe, carefully, consciously, through living minds. In those days, nothing was written. Writing existed, yes, but it was not trusted with something this alive. Ink fades, palm leaves decay, but a mind trained in mindfulness becomes a vessel that renews itself. This was not blind faith in memory. It was disciplined remembrance. Monks trained themselves to recite together, repeatedly, rhythmically. Teachings were shaped into patterns of sound that the body could hold, like a chant carried by breath, like footsteps remembered by muscle rather than thought. This oral tradition was not casual storytelling. It was exacting. A single phrase mattered. A pause mattered. Even the order of teachings mattered. Not for aesthetics, but because insight unfolds in sequence. And yet, within this precision, there was no rigidity of ego. No one said, "This is my version." No one claimed ownership. The Dhamma was not a possession. It was a responsibility. Each monk became a living bridge between past and future, knowing that distortion could arise not only from malice, but from attachment. Attachment to views, attachment to cleverness, attachment to being right. So humility became part of preservation. If uncertainty arose, it was acknowledged. If memory wavered, it was examined. Truth was approached together, not defended alone. This stands in stark contrast to how we often handle disagreement today. In our time, when two people remember differently, the goal is rarely understanding. It is victory. Opinions harden into identities. Differences become threats. But the First Council did not ask, "Who is correct?" They asked, "What accords with liberation?" This question cuts through pride, because liberation is not impressed by eloquence. Freedom does not respond to force. Only clarity recognizes clarity. It is said that the elders tested teachings against lived realization. Did these words align with the end of suffering? Did they encourage restraint, compassion, wakefulness? Did they loosen clinging or strengthen it? If a teaching led toward craving, it was suspect. If it fed self-importance, it was questioned. If it encouraged harshness, it was set aside. This was their compass, not popularity, not novelty, but the subtle taste of freedom. And here, a quiet truth emerges. The Dharma was not preserved because it was old. It was preserved because it worked. It transformed minds. It softened hearts. It ended suffering, not in theory, but in practice. This is why it mattered so deeply to preserve it accurately. Not to honor tradition for tradition's sake, but to ensure that what healed once could heal again. Over time, different groups of monks took responsibility for different collections of teachings. Some focused on the discourses, others on discipline, others on analytical reflections. This division was not fragmentation. It was stewardship, like gardeners tending different sections of the same forest, each ensuring that nothing essential was neglected. And yet, despite this care, change was inevitable. Languages evolved, cultures shifted, geographies reshaped interpretation. The Dharma traveled from forests to cities, from oral circles to written texts, from India to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Tibet. Each step introduced new metaphors, new expressions, new emphases. Some see this as dilution, others as evolution. But if we look closely, we see something remarkable. Despite all this movement, the heart of the teaching remained recognizable. Suffering, its causes, the possibility of freedom, the path of mindful living. Like a river flowing through different landscapes, the water changed shape, but not its nature. This continuity did not happen by accident. It happened because early preservation was rooted, not in ideology, but in awakening. Those who remembered the teachings were not merely scholars. They were practitioners. They knew the terrain of the mind intimately. They had walked the path to its end. So when later generations encountered the Dharma. Even through layers of translation and culture, they could still feel its authenticity. It spoke to something universal, to the restless heart, to the anxious mind, to the quiet longing for peace. In this way, the First Council did more than preserve words. It preserved a way of seeing, a way of meeting experience without clinging, a way of living without unnecessary harm. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal, because preservation is not only something that happened long ago, it is happening now within each of us. Every time you hear a teaching and choose to practice it rather than argue with it, you preserve the Dharma. Every time you pause before speaking harshly, remembering the cost of careless words, you preserve it. Every time you notice craving arise and do not obey it blindly, you preserve it. The Dharma survives not because texts endure, but because minds awaken. And this brings us to a gentle, unsettling question. What are we preserving in our own lives? Not as Buddhists or non-Buddhists, but as human beings. What habits are we passing forward unconsciously? What reactions are we repeating without examination? What beliefs are we clinging to simply because they are familiar? Just as the early Sangha feared distortion of the teaching, we might ask, what distortions quietly shape our days? We live in an era of unprecedented access to information. Teachings are everywhere. Videos, quotes, books. Wisdom is marketed, simplified, accelerated, yet something essential is often missing: depth. The First Council did not rush. They did not compress the Dharma into slogans. They did not bend it to fit attention spans. They trusted that those who were ready would listen, and those who listened deeply would change. Perhaps this is why the Dharma still whispers across time, despite the noise of the modern world, because it does not compete for attention. It waits, like a still pool beneath moving clouds. And when someone, exhausted by chasing and striving, finally stops, the reflection appears. In the next part, we will turn toward the challenges that arose after this first act of preservation, the disagreements, the divisions, and the deeper question of unity within diversity. For now, let the teaching rest where it belongs, not in the head, but in the quiet space that knows when something is true. Time moves quietly, but it leaves traces. After the First Council, the Dharma did not remain sealed within a single cave, a single community, or a single interpretation. It moved, as all living things do, outward, encountering new minds, new landscapes, new conditions, and wherever it moved, questions followed. Not questions born of doubt alone, but of how do we remain faithful without becoming rigid? How do we adapt without losing the heart? How do many voices speak one truth without drowning each other out? These questions did not appear centuries later. They arose almost immediately, because wherever humans gather, even sincere, awakened humans, difference arises. Some monks emphasized discipline above all else, fearing that relaxation would lead to decay. Others leaned toward flexibility, trusting intention more than form. Some focused on meditative absorption, others on insight through inquiry. Some valued solitude, others community. None of these were betrayals. They were reflections of human temperament. The First Council did not eliminate difference. It created a reference point, a deep remembering of origin. And this is crucial. Unity does not require sameness. It requires a shared root. As the Sangha grew, disagreements emerged, not about liberation itself, but about how best to walk toward it. Over time, these differences crystallized into distinct schools. Councils followed councils. Debates arose. Clarifications were offered. Lines were drawn, then redrawn. From the outside, this can look like fragmentation, but from within, something else was happening. The Dharma was being tested, not by enemies, but by life. Each culture asked the teaching, can you speak our language? Can you meet our suffering? Can you survive our habits, our fears, our hopes? And again, the answer was yes, though never without effort. This adaptability did not come from changing the core truth. It came from understanding it deeply enough to express it skillfully. Just as a skilled physician does not prescribe the same medicine and the same dose to every patient, The Dharma found new expressions without losing its healing function. And yet, the danger the First Council feared never fully disappeared. Distortion remained possible, not through forgetting alone, but through over-attachment. Attachment to form, attachment to identity, attachment to being the true inheritor. When tradition becomes a badge, wisdom recedes. This is why the early emphasis on direct experience mattered so deeply. The elders did not say, "Believe this," because it was said. They asked again and again, "Does this lead to the end of suffering?" This question became a silent judge across generations. Whenever a teaching hardened into dogma, practitioners returned to the mind itself. Whenever words multiplied without clarity, meditation pared them down again. The Dharma corrected itself through practice. This self-correcting nature is its quiet genius. It does not depend on centralized authority. It does not collapse when leaders fail. It does not require perfection to function. It asks only one thing: honesty with experience, honesty with suffering, honesty with the movements of the heart. And here we must pause, because this is where history and the present meet. Today, many encounter Buddhism not as a lived path, but as an idea, a philosophy, a self-help tool, a brand of calm. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. Every doorway matters. But something essential can be lost when preservation becomes consumption. The First Council did not gather to admire the Buddha's words. They gathered because those words had reshaped their lives. They knew what was at stake. They knew that a distorted teaching could mislead sincere seekers, that a softened truth could delay freedom, that a misunderstood path could deepen confusion. And so, they treated the Dharma with reverence, not as sacred object, but as living medicine. We might ask ourselves, do we listen this way today? Not just to Buddhist teachings, but to anything that claims to point toward peace. Do we slow down enough to taste whether it truly nourishes? Do we test it against our own suffering? Or do we collect ideas like ornaments? The elders preserved the Dharma because they trusted something greater than opinion, the clarity born of stillness, and stillness cannot be faked. This is why the cave matters, not symbolically, but practically. A cave strips away distraction. It removes audience. It humbles the voice. In such a place, truth does not need defense. It stands on its own. We may not sit in caves today, but the invitation remains to create inner spaces where listening is possible, to resist the urge to constantly reinterpret before understanding, to remember that wisdom unfolds at the pace of insight, not ambition. The First Council did not seek to control the future. They simply ensured that those who came after would have a clear starting point. What they did with it would depend on their sincerity. And so it is with us. We inherit teachings, practices, and values, not only from Buddhism, but from family, culture, and society. Some liberate, some bind. Preservation is not passive. It requires discernment. What do we carry forward? What do we let go? What do we examine rather than assume? When we live without reflection, distortion multiplies. When we pause and look honestly, clarity returns. This is the hidden continuity between that ancient gathering and this very moment. They sat together to remember the path. We sit, in our own way, to rediscover it, not as history, not as belief, but as an intimate inquiry into suffering and release. The Dharma has survived wars, migrations, schisms, and centuries of misunderstanding. Not because it is fragile, but because it is resilient. And resilience does not come from rigidity. It comes from depth of seeing, depth of compassion, depth of commitment to truth over comfort. As long as even one person turns inward with sincerity, the lineage continues, not on paper, not in institutions, but in awareness itself. In the next and final part, we will return to the quiet human heart and consider what it truly means to be a guardian of the teachings here and now. For now, Let this understanding settle gently, like embers glowing long after a fire has passed, not burning loudly, but warm enough to guide the way. The First Buddhist Council did not end with certainty. It ended with trust. Trust that the Dhamma, when held with humility, would outlive those who spoke it. Trust that future generations would listen, not only with ears, but with their lives. Trust that truth, when aligned with compassion, does not vanish. It changes hands. Those monks left the cave and returned to the world. They begged for food. They walked dusty roads. They sat beneath trees and taught quietly, without knowing how far their words would travel. They did not imagine us, and yet here we are, still listening. Not because the past was perfect, but because care was taken when it mattered most. The preservation of the teachings was never about guarding relics. It was about guarding clarity. It was about ensuring that suffering would not be met with confusion, but with a path. And now, gently, the responsibility passes again. Not to preserve every word, but to preserve the intention, to meet experience honestly, to soften when the heart hardens, to wake up again and again from distraction. In a world that rewards speed, outrage, and certainty, choosing mindfulness is a quiet act of courage. Choosing compassion is a form of remembrance. If this reflection has stirred something in you, even faintly, let it be enough. You do not need to become someone else. You do not need to adopt a label. Just listen more deeply. And if you wish to continue walking this path together, slowly, thoughtfully, I invite you to stay, to follow this space of stillness, where ancient wisdom meets modern life, and where the flame is not owned, only passed, carefully, warmly, from one open hand to another. May your steps be gentle, may your seeing be, and may the path reveal itself one quiet moment at a time.